On the day that my friend and I went searching for the Catawanga, I lay in a field of cotton-spun dandelions and roasted in the evil gleam of the sun. It was one of the dog days of summer, when all the shadows are golden and the days never end. It just runs languidly onward like a paint smear. The sky was pristine blue of a hydrangea flower, without a cloud in sight. Every so often, Elliot would leap up excitedly, claiming he could see a cloud forming, but it was always a plane or a trick of the light or a runaway dandelion waltzing through the air. Chris grabbed Elliot's ankle as he went to jump up again and shoved him back onto the grass. "There's no goddamn clouds." "Language?" Elliot looked mildly offended. Chris snorted. He was a football player through and through, with huge shoulders and a temper to match. So I quickly got up in the hopes of heading off a confrontation. "I'm bored. Let's go play catch or something." Chris started to agree, but paused. A dangerous light came into his eyes, and I was immediately afraid. According to Chris, his ideas were brilliant. According to literally anyone else, they were insane. Like the time he'd suspended the school weeb, Peter, from a tree branch to see if the squirrels would eat him. Peter had hung him there like an overweight flag for 6 hours. "Have you guys heard of the Catawanga?" He stared straight at Elliot as he said it. "I heard that it lurks in the old Fairground and eats bad kids who wander off. It's got the eyes of a snake, and it ties the bones of its victims into its fur. Little Willie's cousin saw it, and he said it has claws like... Chris fumbled for the right words. "Knives?" I suggested. "Yeah, like knives. There's no such thing. It's probably some animal." Elliot didn't sound very sure of himself, though. Of course, I knew about the Catawanga. Everybody in town knew about it. The stories were many and conflicting. In some, it was a great dragon who hoarded the skulls of children and only brought them out during rainy nights to admire them in the light of the moon. In others, the Catawanga was a great man-beast abandoned by his family, bitter and afraid of the world. But always, it lived in the abandoned fairground, and always, it was very, very hungry. In my town's heyday, people came from all over the world to see the famous Grenadine Circus, open all year round and fun for the whole family. But that was a long time ago. What I knew about the circus came from the old geezers clustered around the creaky folding tables, telling stories about their youth. Everyone knew that half those stories were made up, and the other half, well, they might as well be. But I had always been fascinated by the circus. Or rather, I was fascinated by the way all the adults treated it. The Catawanga was not regarded as one of the harmless legends for the little kids to tell when they were warm and safe around the campfire. To my parents, to the parents of all the other kids that I knew, the Catawanga was real, and the circus was to be avoided at all costs. "The Catawanga isn't real," Elliot said again, more firmly. "Probably everyone freaked out about a cougar or a tiger or a really hairy guy." "We don't get those around here," I hesitated. "Well, we do get hairy people, but I've never seen any predators bigger than that ugly babysitter of yours." The last remark was directed at Chris. "Right, everybody shut up. I'm going to the fairground, and y'all are chicken if you don't come." Under the dire threat of being called a chicken, Elliot and I followed Chris as he confidently strolled away. My town was given a name by the 20-somethings who lived there, the ones who were too old to be satisfied with the tiny lives they lived here, but too young to accept that big lives were meant for big kids born in big cities far away from people that believed in Catawangas. The 20-somethings called my town Satan's Soul because it was so small. My friends and I made it to the fairground in less than 10 minutes. Vines twined up the poles that held up a sign which proudly proclaimed Grenadine Circus. It was barely recognizable. It had decaying wooden things that might once have been stalls, ground covered in leaves that crunched at every step, and anthills. Lots and lots of anthills. Chris smacked his meaty palms together. "Let's go hunt us some Catawanga meat." Elliot rolled his eyes. We walked into the circus together, because when we actually got there, Chris didn't seem all that keen to go first. Elliot trailed his fingers over a row of half-submerged cages. I wonder where all the animals went when the circus shut down. There was a crashing sound to the side. Elliot and I looked over to see a half-exposed basement with a ladder leading down into it. Chris moaned at the bottom. I rushed up, sliding down the ladder, and grabbed at Chris. "Dude, are you all right?" He started crying, great sobbing gasps that gradually transformed into hysterical laughter. You should have seen your face." Chris stood up and dusted himself off, pleased at his prank. I sighed and turned to leave, but growls from the back of the room stopped me. "It's probably just the wind." "It's just the wind," I said, doing my best to sound sure. But nails scraped along stone, undermining my words. "That's it. I'm out." Chris retreated up the ladder. "Chicken," Elliot yelled at his back. "The Catawonga isn't real." The growls got louder. "The Catawonga isn't real." Elliot's face was pale. "I'm not leaving. I'm not a chicken." I tried to pull Elliot away, but he stood his ground. "The Catawonga isn't real," Elliot screamed into the black of the room, as if he could wish the shadowy shape moving at the back of the room into non-existence. "The Catawonga isn't real, and we don't get predators here, and you aren't allowed to be real." He bellowed the words out as if some tiny, important thing was about to be broken, and that was the last thing he could ever say. I glanced at the shape. It was just a lump of shadows in the corner. I grabbed Elliot's arm and decided I didn't want to see it move. I talked to him calmly, projecting what I didn't feel. "Elliot, come on, let's go. It'll be okay, Elliot. We have to leave now." Growls bubbled up from behind me. "Elliot, move!" Elliot's face went pale. He pointed over my shoulder with one trembling finger. The bear was rather pathetic. It lunged for us, but only made it halfway, banging its nose against the ground and whimpering like a petulant child. The bear's fur was falling out in patches. Its eyes were covered with milky white film, and it sniffed the air, trying to find its dinner. All those years of being endlessly crammed onto bicycles and paraded around like an oversized dog, followed by years alone in the fairground, had taken their toll on the creature. Despite that, it was very big and very obviously hungry. "But we don't get bears here," I said stupidly. "I told you," Elliot whispered. "I asked what happened to the circus animals, and now we know. I told you so." I grabbed Elliot by the arm and pulled him out of the basement. As we scrambled up the ladder, I glanced back. The last thing I saw was the faded red collar around the bear's neck, the last remnant of the Grenadine circus. Elliot and I met Chris by the edge of the grounds and told him about the bear. I guess the Catawonga isn't real, just some dumb kids making up stories about a bear. He sounded disappointed, even though he had run away from the bear like he had bees in his pants. Yeah, I guess. I was relieved, though. Something moved in the trees. The wind died down suddenly, and I could just barely hear a scraping that sounded like long, long claws sliding across concrete. The sound got louder and louder, built until I could feel the vibrations in my chest. There was a figure inside the gate, large and bulbous, with limbs protruding at seemingly random angles. One of those limbs held a limp hunk of meat that still had a red collar around its neck. It didn't have a face, but something about the way it lounged there made it seem undeniably smug. Chris wasn't the only one who ran away that time. I never saw the Catawonga again, but as soon as I turned 18, I moved away with no plans and no money. Elliot left too, but Chris stayed. He'd always been stubborn like that. On my 20th birthday, he was found headless just outside the fairgrounds. Someone was screaming. The sound pulled me from a dream, and I woke in the dark, short of breath and damp with sweat. It was my mother, I realized. Have you ever noticed how you can recognize the voice of one close to you,
even through as little as a cough or a cry. There's no need for words. I heard and knew it was her. I sat up in bed, confused and frightened. The screams had stopped, but I could still hear talking downstairs. My parents. I slid out from beneath the covers and crept to my door, bare feet cold on the ancient wooden boards. A decade had passed, but I still remember the strongest details. The way those floorboards creaked, the dust that made me sneeze, the shadows of the night clouds slipping silently across the scene, nipping at my heels. All these things, as meaningless as they were, are burned into me, like scars when I close my eyes. Mom and Dad's voices were raised, upset. In our old home, they would have woken the neighbors by now. But not here, not in the middle of nowhere. There was no one within a mile. I held the door handle and eased it down so it made no sound, stepping into the hallway, leaving my door open behind me. Moonlight spilled out around my feet, a pale wash chasing shadows into the corners. Felt like I'd only been asleep for a few hours, but I couldn't be certain. I worked my way to the top of the stairs, a few inches at a time. I could make out occasional words from below, but nothing yet that made any sense. I'd stopped to listen when the door beside me creaked open, making me jump. My younger sister, Maria, was only 6, all wide eyes and worried face and tousled black hair that hung wild around her. I recall thinking it was odd that our brother Ryan hadn't left his room. Usually if our parents woke us up with their arguing, he would be up first, to get us back to sleep and tell us not to worry, to tell us not to listen. "Go to bed," I hissed at her. She frowned and retreated, but kept the door ajar. I tiptoed forward onto the top step, listening. My father, loud and demanding. "Tell you again. Now don't make me do it, Lisa." Do what? My mother's angry, tearful. "Crazy. Don't do this. Call the police. Phone an ambulance. Please, David, please." Her voice went on as I heard footsteps approaching the stairs. They were coming up. A surge of panic, and I turned, rushing back to my room. I caught my sister peering around her doorframe and mouthed, "Go!" to her as I passed. The footsteps behind me grew closer, my mother's voice clear. I climbed back into bed, heart racing, when I heard her feet in the hallway. They went into Ryan's room, which was opposite of Maria's, but not their own opposite mine. Why, I wondered. Where was my brother? Dad was speaking, voice thick and heavy. He told Mom to sit down, then again louder, and she snapped a reply I couldn't make out. "Did you break the rules I gave you?" he asked her. "Did any of you?" My mother replied inaudibly. "Did you break any of the rules I gave you?" His voice raised again. "Just answer me!" "No." Her voice broke as she shouted back. "No, please, David, for God's sake, phone an ambulance. It might not be too late. It might not. You don't know. You don't know it." "Did anyone come in the house?" He cut her off, tone low and threatening. "Did any of you leave?" "No, David, please." She was still speaking when I heard him step into the hall. Then the door closed and keys rattled. My mother's voice rose to a scream, and I could hear her running across the floor. "What are you doing?" Her hands were hammering on the door. "David, what are you doing? Don't hurt them, David. Don't you hurt our girls. David, please." Why would she say that, I thought. He would never hurt us. My father would never hurt me. What was going on? I heard the creak of floorboards beneath her cries, and then Dad opened my sister's door. He spoke quietly. I couldn't make it out. Maria's door closed and locked. Then he was walking again, towards my room. Mom was still shouting, sobbing, calling our names, words collapsing into each other until they were only sounds of frustration, pain, and rage. My door opened. I looked over the edge of the covers, pretending I was still asleep. I was so scared, I didn't know what else to do. My father stood in the doorway. He was holding a shotgun, and it was pointed at my chest. "Evie, sweetheart, we need to talk." We had only been in the house for a week. If everything had went to plan, we would have been gone before another month had passed. At the beginning of the year, Dad's elder brother had passed away. He was the only one living member on that side of the family, so my father inherited everything. Our parents were contacted by a law firm who had been engaged as executors of the will, and a meeting was organized to discuss the details. Now, our dad hadn't spoken to his brother in decades, or anyone on his side of the family for that matter. Ryan, Maria, and myself had never met any of them. Dad would never talk about them. Strangely, he seemed more worried than upset by the news of our uncle's death. When my parents attended the meeting, the true scope of the inheritance was revealed. The home, left to him, was more than a century old and had once housed 20 family members and staff. 3 floors, basement, attic, outhouse, and miles of property. At present, most of the place was filled with an accumulation of possessions of 5 generations of rich landowners. The contents alone could be worth a small fortune. The house and the grounds certainly were. My mom, shocked and delighted, couldn't wait to tell us. Dad, however, remained taciturn, simultaneously unsurprised and pained by his apparent good fortune. He didn't want to accept it, he said. Our mother couldn't believe him and demanded to know why. Because of the condition of the will, he told her. We would all have to move there and take possession of the house. No one except family could be allowed inside, not under any circumstances. But he didn't want to go back there, no matter what the offer was. He certainly wouldn't take his wife and children to that godforsaken place. Mom was furious. She thought it was crazy to turn it down. So what if he had to move there? His refusal to explain any further only made it worse. They argued on and off for weeks. There was a silence between them that went on for days until we were in bed. Then the arguments would begin again. Why wouldn't he accept the house? She would ask. Why wouldn't he explain? My father never answered, just repeated the same refusal and denials. Whatever happened there's over, I heard her say one night. You never spoke to them, never spoke about any of them. They're gone. I'm your wife. We're your family, here and now. I lay awake in bed, picking out bits and pieces as I tried to sleep. I never heard the final argument, but Ryan did. He told me and Maria about it on the walk to school. Mom said she had spoken to a lawyer of her own about the will. We could move there for just a short time, she said, maybe only a month. Then we claim we can't stay because it's hurting the kids' upbringing. It wouldn't even be a lie. There isn't a good school for 40 miles, police or ambulance for that matter. No other families are nearby. It's isolated. We say it's affecting all our mental health. There's no living relatives to contest with. My lawyer thinks that we could fight it out in court and win. Afterwards, we sell what we can and keep what we like. Do anything we want. We'll be rich, David. No more 5 people living in 2 bedrooms. We could do whatever we want. All we have to do is make it look like we tried. My father hadn't replied. Then Mom told him that she would leave with us if he didn't accept it. Divorce. To be refusing this opportunity, just throwing away all our futures, she said, over reasons that he couldn't even explain. If he could be that stupid and selfish, then he didn't deserve to be our father, and wasn't the man that she thought he had been. David had left after that, Ryan told us. Went out for hours during the night. The 2 of them didn't speak at all the next day. Then a week later, our parents sat us down and said they had news. We were going away together to clear out and sell the old house that we had inherited. It should only be a month or so, they said. Then we could come back home. I need you to tell me what you done today. Dad? I began to cry, unable to hold back the tears. What's going on? Why is... Answer me, Evie. I don't want to hear anything else. Tell me what happened today, and nothing else. You understand? When I drove back to the city this afternoon, did someone come to the house? Did any of you leave? Tell me true. He never came any closer than the doorway, keeping the gun on me the entire time. Nothing happened. I was too upset to think clearly, unable to take it all in. My mother told him we never left the house, didn't she? Why had she lied? Was Dad gonna hurt me if he found out? I glanced at the wall beside my room, and he noticed. You heard what we were saying, me and your mom. Of course you did. I didn't reply. I just wiped away the tears and tried to hold back any more. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you, baby. The barrel lowered. I could see his eyes were red where he'd been crying. This was hurting him, I realized. Doing this was hurting him. I just need you to tell me the truth. This is very important, Evie. What did you do today? Did you go out? I was just a child, overwhelmed and confused. Every time in my life I'd been frightened, I would run to my dad. Every time I needed someone, I could call his name and he'd be there. Now he was the one I was scared of, and I was lost. I started to get out of bed to go to him, but he pulled back, the gun snapping up. No! He pointed the weapon right at me. Stay where you are. Don't move. Back on the bed. There was a pleading in his eyes and voice. Please, Evie, don't make me. I had never seen him angry and emotional like this. Never in my life. He'd never even shouted at me before. He just wasn't that type of man. Evie, tell me right now, did any of you leave the house today? Yes. I saw it hit him. This truth, like a physical blow, sapping the strength from his body. He took a faltered step back and leaned against the doorframe, face paling to ghost white, a sharp intake of breath through his clenched teeth. We went to the village. I kept talking, not knowing what else to do. I couldn't stop the words once they had started. All of us, we got separated at the shop, and Mom got angry. Maria, she ran off to see the horses. There were horses in one of the open fields. I went after her, but she wouldn't come back. Mom and Ryan had to help till we found her. I remember that afternoon, chasing my sister down stone side streets under the gray sky. We were just going for a walk. Mom had told us to get out of the house for an hour. She had said, handing us our coats, but remember, don't tell your dad. She laughed, and Ryan did too. Dad was being silly, we thought. The four of us took a winding path through the trees and across the fields of wet grass until we reached the village. A church, a shop, and a dozen homes. We found everything closed and silent. I didn't see a single other person, not even a face at a window or a passing car. Maybe no one lives here anymore, Ryan said. Mom didn't say anything. When Maria ran off, I followed, but I couldn't make her come back on her own. I went for my mom and brother. When I found Maria the second time, we all came home. Nothing happened. How long were you all separated? My father's words were cold now, flat and emotionless. How long were you on your own? I don't know. How long, Evie? 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. He wasn't looking at me anymore, just staring at the floor. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and backed into the hall. Daddy, where's Ryan? He glanced up, our eyes meeting, and I'd never seen hurt on his face like I did then. But he didn't answer me, just swung the door closed and locked it. A minute or so passed, and I could hear him pacing the floor, steps interspersed with cries from my mother, which he ignored. Then his voice, just outside my room. Evie, I need you to stay here for a little while, baby. Stay away from this door. I'll be back soon, okay? There was a second pause, and then, I love you. I heard him go to my sister's room. He spoke to her briefly through the door, then he headed upstairs. My mom kept shouting, calling his name as the footsteps receded. I hadn't even moved since he left, just sat there on the bed, cracked and hollowed out. "Evie?" My mom's voice came from the next room. I went to the wall and knelt down, pressing my ear against it. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" "I'm okay, Mom. Did I do something wrong?" "No, baby, no, of course not. I'm gonna get us out of here, okay? It's gonna be all right. He won't hurt you. I won't let him hurt you. Your dad, he just isn't feeling well. He isn't himself. We'll get help. It's gonna be okay. I promise." I could hear footsteps on the stairs again, and my mom moved away from the wall. The rattle of keys and the door of her room opened. I stayed where I was, still and listening. "Get back to the window, Lisa." My father's voice was colder than before, dead and hardened. "I told you not to go out. Why'd you lie to me?" "You were pointing that gun at me." She didn't cry anymore. Her words were clear and angry. "I was scared. I didn't know what you would do if I told you. I didn't know what to say. I'd seen our..." "Stop. Tell me what happened today." "We went out, like Evie told you. We went for a walk, David. A grown woman and her children went out for a walk. We're not prisoners, are we? We're not..." "I asked you not to. I've never asked anything of you since we've been together." His voice strained, cracking as he spoke. I've never asked you to do anything for me, change anything for me, not ever. It was just this once I needed you to trust me. One time, follow the rules I gave you." "Why, David, why? You order your family to follow these stupid rules, but you won't explain why. We thought you were losing your mind. All of us did. You've been so strange since we got here. You won't tell me anything. I'm your wife. You act like I'm some idiot who can't be told the truth." "Shut up." His reply was so loud and sudden that I pulled away from the wall. "You don't have any idea. No idea what you've done." "Then tell me." Her voice changed, pleading, understanding. "Tell me what's going on. You can tell me, David. We can..." "Stop it. Stop changing the subject. What happened today in the village?" "Nothing, David. Nothing happened. We went to the local shop, but it was closed. Walking in the..." "You got split up. The four of you." "Maria ran off. Was gone for 2 seconds, David. You know what she's like. She ran off and Evie went after her. When she couldn't catch her, we split up and found her." Something clattered on the floor. "Put 'em on. There's a metal bar underneath the window. Around that." "Are you serious?" "Do it, Lisa." I heard her moving, then the sound of a chain followed by a metallic snap. She started to speak again, but he was already leaving, locking the door behind him. He went to Maria, and a few minutes passed, voices too quiet to understand. I thought I heard Maria crying, but I couldn't make out any words. I was too afraid to move closer to listen. Then more footsteps. "Evie, can you hear me?" "Yes." My voice wavered, coming out as a broken whisper. "I need you to stand away from the door. Back at the window, baby, okay? I'm gonna come in, but I need you to stand there. Do you understand?" Uh-huh. "Speak properly, Evie. Say you understand. This is important." I understand." "Do it now, honey." I scrambled over to the glass on all fours and put my back against the ledge. For a second, I saw the keyhole go dark and realized he was looking through it. Then the door unlocked, and he came in, gun still raised and pointed at me. He had a pistol now as well. I caught a glimpse of it under his shirt, tucked into his belt. His other hand held a pair of handcuffs. He tossed them on the floor, and they skidded to my feet. "The metal bar behind you, Evie, under the window. Put the cuffs around that bar, then clip them on your wrist." I nodded, picking them up and trying to do as he asked. "You have to trust me, baby, okay? I've always protected you, haven't I? Always. I need you to trust me." The handcuffs clicked into place, and I tightened them as he instructed. Then he backed out again and was gone. Through the window, a full moon flashed beneath the clouds. My breath steamed the glass, and the metal of the cuffs were cold on my skin. All I could do was wait. That house was unusual in many ways, not simply its isolation or my father's fear. Some of these things were small details I didn't pick up at first or thought nothing of, but not all. With the exception of my parents' room, every door was thick, heavy, and locked with a key. The only difference in their door was having no key, just an iron latch on the inside. As for the windows, none could be opened from either side, not on any floor. Those metal bars that he put the cuffs around could be found under every one of those windows. The basement was filled with dusty, battered books we weren't allowed to read, and moldy boxes we weren't allowed to look at. Then there was the attic. My brother had gotten a look inside before Dad sent him back downstairs. It was filled with weapons, Ryan had told me. Old rifles and pistols and crossbows, marked and faded with rust and wear. Every part of the house seemed to be wasting away, decaying like a carcass stripped of its bones. It felt like somewhere you hid from life, not somewhere you lived. There was a story there only my father knew, and it was a story he would never tell. When he returned, he went to my mother first. I shuffled as close to the wall as I could to listen. I've checked every part of this house to be certain. No one else is in here. No one else could have gotten in. It's impossible. That's how this place was built. I know that as well as anyone. I survived here for 16 years. My mother's reply was quiet, barely audible. You're sick, David. You need help. All of this, it's insane. What are you doing here to me, to your family, to our girls, our son, Ryan, our son, David? This is insane. Whoever's done it is in this house, Lisa. You understand that, don't you? Do you get that? He went on as if he hadn't heard her. One of the four of us. Could be you see. Could be you who... Well, we'll find out when the sun comes up. What are you talking about? Please, David, please! I couldn't have told you. You would have thought I was crazy. You'd have taken the kids. I tried to stay away from this place, but you wouldn't listen. Didn't leave me any choice, did you? I should have known better. I did know better, but I still made the wrong decision. I could hear the waver in his speech, the grief and the pain and desperation. David, they aren't like people think, he snapped, suddenly cutting her off. They're patient. Easier to stop in some ways. Much, much harder in others. They need to catch you alone. We're safe when we're inside or together, you see. Should never be alone, especially not outside. He paused for a moment, and I pressed close to the wall. The wounds don't even show. I know that. I remember that. So you can't tell. Sometimes they don't even know what they are, Lisa. Like two minds in one body, like a parasite inside, waiting for a chance. David, his words were calm and focused. Listen to me. I don't understand what you're saying. I can't understand. But we can help. Please, whatever it is, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Put down the gun. Let's go and call for help. We can go home. We can... No, it's too late for that. It's much too late. If you'd done what I asked, just done what I asked, it wouldn't have to be this way. But you never listened to me. Never. I heard movement then, and the door locked again. He went to my sister's room, and a minute later, he came to see me. He was pale, soaked in sweat, bottom lip cracked and bleeding. Evie, I have to do this, honey, okay? To keep you safe, to keep us all safe. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, but we have to do this. They can hide away from the crosses and questions, but the light always hurts them, at least a little. So then we'll know. I think I must have slept eventually. The sound of my father pacing the halls, the occasional shouts of my mother, they all faded as the empty hours passed. I used my feet to pull down the cover and pull it around me as best I could. I thought about my brother. Was he hurt? Mom had wanted to call the police, call an ambulance. Why wouldn't Dad do that? What had happened? Ryan couldn't be dead. No, not my brother. He couldn't be. I watched the forest through the dark windows, its glass now touched with frost. Watched for so long, I didn't know if I was awake or in a dream. The wind sighed and moved, and the shadows followed. And those dark shapes between the trees could have been figures or branches, or nothing at all. Morning was close. As the hours passed, I thought I could hear scraping sounds from Mom's room, very faint, only growing louder when my father was downstairs to use the toilet. When he returned, she began shouting at him again, loud and suddenly. He ignored her for a minute, then, realizing she wasn't going to stop, strode to her room. I heard the lock turn and the creak of hinges. Then it began. Rapid footsteps, followed by a cry, something striking flesh and a person falling, or more than one. My mother cursed, and metal hit the floor. I had sat up, every muscle tensed. I could hear her breathing heavily, moving around the room, lifting and dragging a heavy something. In a second, she was at my door, unlocking it and pulling it open, saying my name. She had the shotgun under one arm, the keys in her hand. She took off my cuffs. Then we were moving together to my sister's room. As I waited for her to open the door, I looked into Ryan's room. My father was on the floor, blood flowing from an ugly wound on the side of his head. Beside him lay the metal bar from under the window frame. I could see the holes in the plaster where my mother had worked it out during the night. He groaned and grabbed my mother's arm to warn her. "Shit!" she cursed as she stepped past me. Then she pulled the door closed and locked it. A minute later, we had my sister and were heading downstairs. As we reached the steps, I heard my father calling our names and slamming against the door. We didn't stop, taking the stairs as fast as we could, clinging to each other. As we reached the ground floor, my mother gave a hard intake of breath and pulled us both towards her, turning our faces away from whatever was there. Another slam came from above us, my father's cries echoing down the stairwell. "Close your eyes for me, both of you. Hold on to me and we'll go together. Keep them closed. Don't open them till we get out, okay? Don't look." We stumbled down those final steps as she held us, guiding us forward. A crash from above made me flinch, but we kept moving. "Go on, almost there." We were in the lounge when I looked again. I saw the hallway to the front door, broke into a run, letting go of my mother's arm. Almost there, I thought. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until I stopped. The sounds of movement, my mother's voice, the shouts from above, it was all gone. I turned and found myself alone. "Mom? Maria?" I started to walk back. I couldn't imagine going without them. "Mom!" I called. Then I saw them, laying together on the ground, Mom pale and motionless on her back. Maria was crouched over her, her face buried against her neck. My sister looked at me and smiled, teeth and lips black with blood. There was a ragged wound on my mom's throat. A gunshot rang out, a sudden thunder in the cold silence. Maria's body spun and fell across my mom, a thin trail of blood raining down across the dusty floor. I cried out, but I was frozen in place, too shaken and frightened to move. I could see my father swaying, blood in his hair and on his clothes, pistol in his hand, still aimed at my sister's body. Then she started to get up. Her tiny frame rose in jerks, unnatural movements, more like a broken puppet than the girl I'd known. She made it to her feet and turned towards him, her head hanging bloody and limp, still smiling, though. "Daddy." He fired again, and the bullet struck her in the chest, knocking her back to the ground. I scrambled away into a corner, eyes closed and ears covered. Another shot. Then another. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the dark and my heart beating, flashing images that I couldn't push away. When I opened my eyes and took my hands away from my ears, it was over. My father walked towards the still body of his wife and youngest child. His feet dragged, arms hanging limp at his side, The gun fell from his hands and clattered across the wooden floor. He seemed to collapse as he went, falling down to them, making only wordless sounds of loss. I watched him there in the weak light, shaking and weeping over them, over the ruins of his life, broken and emptied of everything but grief. A pain for which no words would suffice. I don't remember getting up, walking to him. I touched his arm, and he saw me at last and pulled me close. The stench of sweat and blood and horror ran across us both, a wound that could never heal, only fester and burn. Outside, the sun was rising. I loved my father, even there at the end. He tried so hard to protect us, to keep us safe. But when humans are afraid, they miss the simplest things. They make mistakes, like thinking my sister was the only one.
So, once upon a time, back when I was about 20, a friend of mine got into some trouble and went to jail. He needed someone to go and stay at his place and take care of his elderly dog and keep his birds fed. I immediately accepted, as I didn't really want to live with my mom and her new, younger boyfriend. Now, here's where I should probably mention that my friend was into some not-so-great stuff. That's how he ended up in jail. So naturally, that meant that some pretty shady characters were going to be around. Those characters usually waited until I went to bed to start coming around and helping themselves to whatever they desired. That was bad enough in its own, but since my friend couldn't pay his electric bill from jail, there were also no lights. Since the bedroom I was staying in had a deadbolt and another lock, I felt okay in there. I of course realized how stupid and naive I was back then. After all, I'm only 5'3", and back then I only weighed about 100 pounds. I guess my desperation for independence drove me to brave it. I would literally wake up the next day to find footprints outside the living room window, and even found the phone line cut once or twice. While all that was going on, my friend's creepy-ass, teeth-missing, pervy landlord started randomly showing up. The landlord only lived about 3 football fields away. Apparently my friend couldn't pay rent from jail either. He also didn't want me to tell his landlord that he was in jail, so I had to keep giving some stupid excuse about him being away at his family's. But that excuse only went so far. Probably knowing full well that it was bullshit, the landlord started showing up even more. When he did, he started saying nasty things like, "My wife and I sure would be excited to have you over, especially in a bikini." Soon enough, though, the landlord started getting angrier and more frustrated. Each and every time he would show up, he would just show up at any given time. And since I didn't drive at the time, I was usually there for these unfortunate visits. Eventually, he just started straight up walking in, not even bothering to knock anymore. I told him that was illegal, but he didn't seem to care. Remember earlier in the story, I mentioned that I slept with a locked door? Well, unfortunately on that particular morning, I had already gotten up and made a trip to the kitchen for some water after the sun had already come up. Because of the daylight, I didn't bother locking the bedroom again. I just closed it. Not long after that, I had fallen back asleep. A strange, slight noise woke me up. It was a sort of soft clicking sound. I gradually opened my eyes, but I didn't see anything, so I tried to go back to sleep. But then, I suddenly started back awake, as I could just feel another presence in the room with me. As I slowly focused my eyes on the light, I saw the old landlord standing over me, mouth breathing with a creepy grin on his sinister face. I instantly bolted upright, whilst grabbing the bed sheets and pulling them over my body. Then I went from 0 to 60 in less than a second. I jumped up and started yelling about, "What the hell are you doing here? What do you think you're doing right now?" All the while, I continued walking towards him angrily. He backed away, practically running out the door. I locked it behind him and screamed, "I'm calling the cops." The cops came, but since I had no proof and he hadn't hurt me, they really couldn't do much. To this day, though, I'll never forget the sound of that old man mouth breathing as he leaned over my sleeping, unsuspecting body.
The year is 1999. I was only 5 at the time, but I remember seeing it for the first time. A man who was parkouring and keeping up with the car. It would leap great distances and land every single jump. They would also grab swings and poles and run along the telephone wires. I was so invested in this imaginary being that I would name them Parkour Man. I'm almost certain anyone reading this has done the same in some capacity, but I never really thought too deeply about it, or why this was a phenomenon that we all share. Like the cool S that everyone used to draw, no one knows the origin of that parkour guy. Ever since I've gotten older, my ability to imagine the guy has gotten worse and worse, and eventually it stopped existing altogether. That is until last week. Monday of last week, to be exact. So ever since I was a child, I would get crazy migraines and body pains. I would also complain to my parents, saying how much it hurt, but they always chalked it up to growing pains or ADHD. Strangely enough, the pains and migraines started to become less and less frequent as I got older. This was the same time I started seeing less and less of the Parkour Man. Fast forward, and I'm now 29 and starting to get random pains and migraines again that I can't explain. So I did the adult thing and went to a doctor about my issues. They did some tests on my blood pressure and a urinalysis, and the doctor called me after a day or two. To my surprise, he told me I was just dehydrated and to drink plenty of water. I drink about a gallon of water a day. I don't know how I'm dehydrated. Eventually, my migraines became so frequent, my wife would be the one driving me around because I couldn't focus on the road with the pain I was in. Monday was when I started to see it again. The Parkour Man jumping from streetlight to building and down, graciously tumbling and climbing. However, he was different this time. The parkour guy I knew wore a ninja mask and wore black clothes, but this one was just a silhouette, and he was constantly staring at me. I looked at my wife as we were going to my next appointment to resolve the problem and asked, "Have you ever looked out the window of a moving car and seen one of those imaginary parkour guys running alongside?" "Well, yeah, I do vaguely, but my life was different when I was a kid, and I couldn't sit still. I haven't in a while, but I imagine I would if I had to ride passenger all the time." She laughed, and I laughed along with her. I didn't tell her that he looked different, or that it was staring at me, or that I saw him at all. The doctor that day was confused about how I was still dehydrated, and prescribed me pills that would help with water retention. My health has declined, and I was starting to feel weaker and weaker as the day went by. Each day felt like I was crawling to get by, and my energy was way down. 3 nights ago, I was awoken by a strange sound coming from the kitchen. My head was pounding and my mouth was dry and sticky. That sound was probably the migraines playing tricks on me, so I would get up and get some water, I told myself, to calm my nerves more than anything. I slowly stumbled to the fridge where we kept a gallon of filtered water for when I needed something to drink, and I also grabbed a couple of Tylenol quick releases to help with the pain. I put the pills in my mouth and drank so much water I had to gasp for air. After I closed the fridge, I heard another strange sound, but this one was outside on my back porch. My porch is about 30 feet off the ground because the house is built on a steep hill. I walked with one eye open to see what it was. I looked around with the blurry vision I had and saw it hanging from my porch, staring at me, though I could only see the top of its fingers and its eyes. Its face was always blank or blurry, but this time I could see its deep black eyes and pale skin. There was a sheen of water on top of its head. I slowly backed away, thinking this may be a hallucination due to fever or pain. I just went back to bed and tried my best to ignore it. The next day I got up and went to the kitchen for more water, and I looked at the porch. The door was wide open. There was no sign of forced entry either, only a single set of footprints entering the home and vanishing once it passed the rear door. Ever since seeing that, I had a strange feeling I was being watched, no matter if I was inside or outside. I could feel it watching me with those black eyes. Throughout the day, I kept experiencing the feeling of unease and dread. The day seemed to drag on, and now and then I would catch a glimpse of the man in the mirror or the glass. I had another appointment that morning and needed to leave. My headache had gotten worse, but the pain and fatigue had been getting better. While inside the car, I laid my head against the cool glass, which gave me a moment of reprieve from the heat and the migraine that I'd been dealing with. I usually closed my eyes, but the feeling of being watched kept me from dropping my guard and sleeping. Looking through the window, I could see it standing in front of the car. This time, I got to see its whole face. Pale white skin with deep black eyes, but no mouth or nose. He only had holes on the sides of his head, which I assumed were his ear holes. Seeing it standing in front of the car shocked me to my core, and I screamed in terror. My wife tried to comfort me by showing me there was nothing there. She stepped out of the car and stood right where it did, and he disappeared behind her. "See, hun? You're just going through delirium due to dehydration. I love you. It's going to be okay." She spoke in a calming voice. However, I knew better. I knew it was real. I don't know what it wanted, but I could feel it was waiting for me to be alone. As we pulled away, I could see its blank, expressionless stare as it stood in our driveway, watching me right away. As we traveled the old streets in the downtown section of my city, I would catch a glimpse of it, staring at me and not moving. It would be on top of a building. Cold, expressionless eyes would meet me and cause me dread and anxiety, as if it was there and there was nothing I could do. I tried my best to look away, but every time I would, it would show up in the center of my vision. I tried closing my eyes, but I could still see it in my head, staring. We arrived at the doctor's office, an off-tan building with a blue tin roof. A sign on the building in an orange hue declared it to be Mercy Medical Center, and it was shining with light. I felt my fear response speak in my chest, telling me not to enter the place, as I was going to die by walking in. The gates of Tartarus were standing in front of me, wanting me all the more. My wife tugged on my shirt and held my hand, guiding me through, her face shining through my fuzzy vision. With her help, I was able to get to my doctor and start talking. Before we started, I had to sign a few forms, which I couldn't remember what was for. An experimental drug, but it was supposed to help. This is a new type of drug meant to target the part of the brain that controls blood pressure and nerves. Seems that your blood pressure is really high, and this should bring it down. We can only guess that it's a hypertensive crisis that it's been drawn out for a week, but since the condition is pretty scary, we've been trying to get you into whatever we can to monitor you. I can give you a shot to take this medication, get it working now, and it'll last all day until around 6 a.m. He pulled out a syringe and plunged it gently into my arm. I sighed in relief as the medicine coursed through my veins. I could feel the pressure of my head reducing and the fuzzy blur starting to sharpen and fade away. I shook his hand and left with my wife. It was such a relief, I cried on the car ride home, being able to look out into the bright midday sky and feel the warmth of the sun on my skin without any of it being overbearing on my body. Best of all, it was no longer in sight, and the feeling of dread and overwhelming anxiety was fading into obscurity. Before we got home, we stopped at the local CVS to get the prescription needed. I got home and the colors were brighter than normal and everything felt better, cleaner, fresher. The lights in my room were clearer and the smell of the home felt more crisp. Everything was fine with no sign of it, and I just forgot all about it as well. I let my guard down. Last night, my dreams were a vivid tapestry of vibrant colors and motions that only Van Gogh could illustrate. It was surreal and amazing, however, this bliss that came to an abrupt stop when I was awoken by my wife's crying. "What's wrong, honey?" I said in a worried tone. The only thing illuminating the room was a soft green light shining from the alarm clock, saying it was 3 a.m. "It wants you, but you keep running. Why do you keep running?" she said. What do you mean?" I said, as I reached towards her hand to move them off her face. As her hands pulled down, I stared in abstract horror. Her eyes were missing, and ink ran down her face. "It needs you." My wife, what I thought was my wife, started to contort vocally and physically. Her bones snapped like fresh celery, and her voice became static as she brought her arms over her head to grab the bottom of her jaw and pull it sharply, ripping it off. The bed was flooded by her warm, viscous blood. In my horror, she kept crawling towards me, crying, asking me to stop taking the medicine. I looked towards the nightstand and saw it standing in the background, smiling at me from a mouth made from tattered flesh and gnarled teeth and the same black eyes. Before I could take the medication, it grabbed my wrist and leaned in close. "You have seen so much. You'll run out eventually, and when you do, I'll welcome you into the void." The searing pain left a black mark on my arm, and I reeled away, and as it just stood there, staring at me. I grabbed the pills and took one quickly, hoping the nightmare would end. It was when I woke up from the dream. My wife was there, sleeping soundly, and I reached over to see her face, but it was normal. I got up to go to the bathroom and wash my face for a minute. The cold water woke me up more. The sudden realization made me almost vomit, knowing what I was seeing was as real as it felt. I looked down at my arm. It's a handprint. It's black on my arm, like a fresh tattoo. I only have 30 days of pills, with my doctors no re-upping on them since they're experimental. Even typing this now, I can see him on my black screen, staring at my every move. What do you do when you meet an impossible situation like this?
It was the 5th year. The 5th freaking year. Every summer since I moved into this place, I've always made an attempt to grow a garden. The thoughts of picking fresh vegetables out of my own yard brought me back to my childhood. In my opinion, they always taste better grown that way. On top of that, it seemed like every single person in the neighborhood had their own lush garden. I could go down a list of reasons why I wanted to grow one. For whatever reason I might use, I believe the work needed to prepare the soil, plant the seeds, and tend to water and weed was well worth it. I want to make this known so you'll understand my frustration when I tell you that I've not harvested a single vegetable from my garden. I do everything right. All the plants are in the perfect place for sunlight. I always make sure they have enough water. What doesn't make any sense is that the plants themselves grow just fine. They grow tall and healthy, showing their beautiful green colors to the neighborhood. I've switched it up plenty of times through the years. I've tried to grow corn, cucumbers, zucchini, radishes, tomatoes, peppers of every kind you can imagine. None of them bore a single thing the whole time they grew. This was the one thing I wanted, ever since I could even contemplate the possibility of owning my own house. I had dreams of growing my very own garden. Well, I finally snapped. It was Halloween. Summer was over, and the weather was turning sour by the day. I had just gotten home from a long day at work. Sitting on my porch was a bowl of Kit Kats for the early trick-or-treaters. Enjoying the sunset as I read a book, I began to think about the failures in my garden. I was becoming stressed out and frustrated at the mere thought of it. I set my book down and went into my garden to get a shovel, angrily marching over to my dying garden. If you're not going to grow me anything, I might as well dig you up and start over, I thought. The thought came over me as I plunged the shovel into the dirt. I almost said it out loud, as if the garden could hear me or something. I put more emotion behind each thrust, putting in more momentum and driving my foot with all the force I could muster, digging deeper as I went. As I kept going, I lost myself in anger, but after a few minutes of this, I realized I couldn't believe I was taking out my anger on my garden. It was only a garden. I slowed down. I was about to stop before my shovel hit something solid. I heard a thump of impact. It wasn't a rock. I jabbed the shovel twice more and heard the same thump-thump both times. Interested, I dug around and scooped out some dirt with my hand, ripping apart networks of small roots to reveal a wooden plank. It didn't appear to be on its own, more like part of a large structure, a box or something. My emotional state turned from anger to excitement. Maybe I hadn't been able to grow a garden in the yard, but I might have just found someone's hidden treasure. I dug even faster in my excited state. Now that my anger was gone, I flung dirt all over, not even remaining attentive enough to keep nice, neat piles. I furiously worked to uncover the surface of the box and found its edges. The thought about what could be inside rattled around in my mind. The worst part was cutting through all the roots to get to the thing. I had a hard time pulling most of them out with my hands, having to use the shovel to chop at them first. Then I took a step back, getting the whole picture. I immediately noticed its shape. It was that of a casket. It was an old one, or at least a makeshift wooden one. I stared at it in disbelief. This house wasn't that old. Why would there be a casket in the yard? It didn't seem possible at the moment. I shrugged the shape off as just being an odd one. I chopped at the roots that crawled around the edges, finishing them off. Reaching down slowly, I gripped the side of the casket and flipped it open. A set of empty eye sockets looked back at me, though what remained of the casket was far from a skeleton. Beside the skull, the rest of the naked body still had plenty of flesh remaining. Too much flesh. The corpse had the musculature of a bodybuilder, more definition than I'd ever seen on a living person. Its organs were visible, barely contained by the muscle tissue around them. Everything about the supposed corpse, besides the head, looked like it was still alive, but the shape of the bone structure seemed inhuman. Its veins were shown clearly through the entire body, and it lacked skin. Each one was connected to roots that crawled around its entire body, roots that filled the rest of the space in the coffin. I knelt just to get a closer look, but I started to hear something. I leaned in further, almost touching this grotesque corpse. I stopped my breathing to listen. The rhythmic beat of a heart filled my ears. I gasped, jerking myself up and stepping back. I felt my own heart beat faster and faster as it rose in my chest, and I found myself breathing rapidly in fright. I ran inside and grabbed the phone, my fingers dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? I found a casket with a body in it in my yard, but there's something wrong with it. I proceeded to give the operator my location, and she assured me that the police weren't en route, only minutes away. After the call ended, I ran outside again to my freshly dug up garden. I was stopped dead in my tracks. My eyes felt like they were about to burst from my skull as I looked before me to see the casket with no corpse. All that remained were the roots, still mended by the body they had been strung across, surrounding what was now only space in an empty casket. It was gone. I looked up, my eyes darting around, spinning my head in all directions. A chill crawled up my spine, and I tensed up as I searched for the corpse. It was nowhere to be seen. The cops pulled up to my house a few minutes later, and 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. I saw them but paid little attention, still scanning around. You the one who called it in? Well, yeah, I did, but it's not here. When you called, you said there was a dead body, correct? I did, yeah, but it's not here. See? I pointed to the hole in my garden. The officers approached, but stopped at the edge, both leaning in to get a peek. They displayed confused expressions. The other officer, who had yet to say anything, let out a single chuckle, as if he found this ridiculous, before shaking his head and turning the other way. The other sighed and looked towards me. Are you aware it's illegal to abuse the use of 911? I don't abuse anything, sir. There was a body here just a few minutes ago. I don't know. You don't know what? What happened to it? You thought it would be cute to set up a little casket, Halloween decoration style, and report a dead body to us.
you dig it up now to make a little display just for us? No, well, yeah, I just dug it up, but This made me think of something. I looked back at the hole, realizing my shovel was nowhere to be seen. Something hit my back. Felt like a droplet of water from a sprinkler. A scream followed from one of the officers. Turning back, I made eye contact with the cold, dead eyes of the first officer and the tip of the shovel that ran through the head, splitting it apart. The shovel was ripped from the back of his skull, and his body fell, head landing at my feet. I was now once again looking at the empty eye sockets of the corpse that had been under my garden. I turned towards the other officer who had drawn his gun. The sound of the first shot shocked me so much, I fell to the ground. The officer popped off bullet after bullet as he retreated to his car, each one connecting with the muscles on the body. The corpse didn't so much twitch in reaction. It kept its slow, steady pace, walking towards the officer. The officer paused, taking a moment to make a well-placed shot. It grazed the top of the corpse's skull and took a chunk with it. This seemed to anger it. In one swift, lightning-quick motion, it raised the shovel and threw it like a javelin, gliding through the officer before bursting through the windshield of the patrol car, pinning him to it. While this happened, I had enough time to draw the gun out of the other officer's holster. By the time I had it, I looked up to see the empty eye sockets of the corpse looking back at me. I booked it to my front door, but by my account, it didn't have any interest in a chase. As soon as I was inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, grabbing my phone and heading for the kitchen, which had the back door to the house. I dialed 911 again, checking the chamber for a round while the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I just called a little while ago. Your officers were just murdered right before my eyes. The thing that killed them is outside my house right now. He killed them with a shovel. With a shovel! I screamed into the phone as I kept the gun raised in the direction of the entryway. You need backup. Lots and lots of backup. Please, get here soon. It's... A boom echoed through the house. I trembled at the sudden noise, raising the gun in my shaking hands that held it. The front door creaked open, and footsteps followed. They only took a few steps inside before they stopped. It's been a long, long time. It could talk. I didn't expect that. I tried to reason with it. What do you want? It seemed to ignore me. All this time, dreaming of this day, the day I would rise and feast on the world once again. Oh, it feels good. I don't want to go back. I began to shake even harder, looking over at my back door, ready to make a run for it any second. Of course, I have you to thank for all this. I looked back to see the corpse staring at me from across the hall. I just needed the fuel, and if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have gotten it. You feeding me all those years, preparing me for this day. Oh, come on, boy. Haven't you always wanted your own little garden? Here I am. The flesh that bound the bottom jaw to the top retracted back. It was smiling at me. I felt dazed, like I was about to throw up. It turned its head back to the front door. Sirens began to approach from the distance. It could tell. It knew they were coming. I took the opportunity, swinging the door open and sprinting through the backyard and the first row of trees that separated me from the neighbors. I ran faster than I could think. Through backyard after backyard, I sprinted. Gunfire erupted from behind me, but I kept going. It sounded as if a war had broken out, and a battle was taking place in my neighborhood. Soon I emerged into the next street, but I kept running. I forgot all about the handgun I was holding. A kid in a Jedi costume noticed, dropping his plastic lightsaber and plastic pumpkin full of candy, screaming as he ran away from me. The dozen or so other kids and some of the adults who accompanied them on the street noticed it too. They screamed and ran as well. I thought about saying something, but I didn't bother. Being scared and on the move was probably for their own good. They didn't know what was behind me. A man emerged from a house in front of me with a shotgun and aimed it at my head. "Stop right there." I did as he said, aware of the situation that I seemed to have created. I raised my right hand with the gun above my head and did the same with my left, showing him my empty palm. "Listen, something's coming. I didn't shoot anyone, I swear. We gotta get out of here, or stop it, or..." "What in the hell are you doing, waving a gun around, scaring all these kids out trick-or-treating? Drop the gun right now." Not wanting to get a face full of buckshot in the street, I dropped the handgun and kept my hands raised. The man turned back inside his house, and I could faintly hear him tell somebody to call the police. He turned back towards me, adjusting his aim. Something caught his attention, and he looked slightly to the left before something collided with his face and knocked him to the ground. It exploded on impact and spewed an orange substance everywhere. It was a pumpkin. I looked to my right to see the corpse walking towards me. It was bleeding profusely and had many obvious holes ripped in its tissue and an even larger chunk torn out of its skull. In one hand it held a jack-o'-lantern. With the other, it pointed at me. "I'm not finished with you yet," it yelled to me. I glanced down. The gun was only a leaping distance away. It seemed like my only choice. I dove, but something hit me before I could make it. It threw the other pumpkin. It fell apart when it hit me, pieces of its shell flying around. I fell on my back and began to gasp for air. It had knocked the wind out of me, and I could tell at least a few ribs had been broken. I felt achy all over my body. It even hurt my neck, and I turned to look at the corpse as it approached me. A gunshot rang through the air, and the corpse stumbled back. It recovered and rose, only to be shot again, this time tripping and falling to the ground. I flipped myself over and began to push myself from the ground. It took 2 attempts to get myself up. I looked up to see a woman on the porch, holding the shotgun the man had been aiming at me. I then looked back down and locked eyes on the handgun. I picked it up as I stumbled back to my feet. I was still shaking and in pain. It limited my ability to hold the sight straight, and I knew I couldn't be very accurate, but I wasn't far from my target. I shot rapidly, some bullets making contact, some just hitting the ground. Behind me, the woman continued to blast the corpse with the shotgun. I was empty, and with her last shell, she shattered the skull to pieces. Its black brains spattered out and painted the pavement. The corpse wasn't moving anymore. I retreated to the porch of the house next to the one with the woman holding the shotgun, keeping my empty gun trained on the now lifeless corpse. More sirens were approaching. After a few minutes, I sat on the stairs and lowered my gun, setting it on the step beside me. I dearly hoped it was finally over. An armored police truck pulled up onto the street we were on, and followed by a caravan of all sorts of emergency vehicles. Ambulances, fire trucks, and even police from some of the other towns around ours. Some stopped on our street, some moved on to my street. The police that stepped out of the armored truck were equipped with heavy body armor and rifles. They surrounded the corpse in the street. The woman on the porch screamed for the paramedics. A few of them ran to her and her husband lying on the ground. I heard the woman cry out in relief and thank them over and over again when one of them said that her husband was going to be all right. I got up and limped my way over to them. I talked with the paramedics for a while and let them know how injured I was. "You're going to have to wait. There are others with more life-threatening injuries, and we need to attend to them." I didn't respond, except for nodding my head. I overheard someone else in the crowd, at first responders, say, "We got 7 dead officers and a dozen dead civilians, with twice that many injured. We don't know how the hell this happened." Hearing this, I lowered myself to the curb, sitting down gently to not hurt myself worse. I watched the woman walk with the paramedics as they carried her husband on a stretcher into the ambulance. She waited outside as they shut the door. She watched the ambulance leave before taking a seat next to me on the curb. I tried to muster something to say, failing horribly. I wanted to apologize to her for what had happened to her husband, but I didn't know what to say. Sorry I dug up that monster in my yard. I didn't think anyone, including myself, was ready to process that. Looking at the side of their house, I opted for a different topic of conversation. "That's a lovely garden you have." She laughed, looking over at it like I was. She paused for a moment and let out a sigh. "Yeah, it might look lovely, but I don't know what's wrong with it. Ever since we moved into this place, the plants we grow have never given us anything. We haven't gotten a single vegetable. Must be something in the dirt."